Okay, welcome everyone. My name's Jack. I'm the Executive Director at One for the World, and it's a particular privilege to get to speak at Meta because this is actually the last of the big tech companies for One for the World. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about what One for the World does today, but a big part of it is speaking at corporations and trying to get people interested in effective giving. And we've done previously a lot of talks at Microsoft, we've done a lot of talks at Stripe and Google, and so I really feel like we're kind of completing the set by coming here. And I know that within Facebook there are lots of people already engaged in effective giving, and so I hope that some of you have never heard about this before, but I hope some of you are old hands and will provide some thought-provoking stuff for you as the talk goes on. So I like to start with these 4 questions because there are kind of 3 main questions I'm going to try and answer today, which are why should we give, where should we give, and how much, which are kind of 3 questions you always have to answer if you're going to think about charitable giving. But these 4 statements, and whether or not we agree with them, give us an idea of how predisposed we are to think about effective giving. So you can see the statements on the screen. It's important to help others. Number 2, people are of equal moral value. Number 3, our resources are limited. And number 4, helping more is better than helping less. Now, probably you agree with at least 3 and maybe all 4 of those statements. And if you do, that means that you're already predisposed to do effective giving. You just might not know it yet. Because they're quite sort of benign sounding statements, but the implications of them are quite profound. So the first one, it's important to help others. We act in a way all the time as if we believe this is true. So if you see someone, think about a trivial example. You're out in the corridor and you see a colleague drop their papers. You would stop and pick them up. You wouldn't just step over the top of them. You wouldn't think it was okay to just choose not to help them if you have the ability to do that. And in bigger ways, if a friend or family member comes to you and they have a problem and you think you know a solution, we'd imagine that you would kind of want to share that, presuming they're receptive to it. We wouldn't think it was okay for you to just hold on to that and not let them know about it. So we act all the time in a way that suggests that we think it's important to help other people. Now, the second one is people are of equal moral value, and usually this is the one that is controversial, if any of these statements is, because everybody thinks of the worst person they've ever met and thinks, I don't think that person's of equal moral value. And plausibly, they're not. But what we're trying to get at here is an idea called impartiality. And what that says is, until we know more about people, if we just take it on the surface, every single person has exactly the same right to health and happiness and fulfillment and safety as everybody else. And we could demonstrate this because if I launched a poll now and said, I've got £100,000 and I'm going to give it to person A or person B and I'd like you to vote for which person is going to get the money, you'd feel really uncomfortable about that because there's just no good way to make that decision. And you'd be really worried, let's say I put up a photograph of each one, you might be worried that you're going to make that decision on the basis of some sort of bias or prejudice. Well, the opposite of that, the idea that until we know more about whether one person is more virtuous than the other or one person is more in need than the other, until that point we should just treat everybody the same. That's really key to effective giving. Because what we actually see in charitable giving is that we regularly prioritize certain groups of people over others, and it's usually for reasons that are quite hard to justify. So things like, do they belong to a group that I also belong to? Do they live in the same country as me? Do they live in the same community as me? Are they someone that I know personally? But if we accept this idea that people are of equal moral value, then those are not particularly good reasons to prioritize one group over another. The third and fourth ones, I think, are just trivially true, so our resources are limited, and helping more is better than helping less. These are sort of definitionally true. Obviously, we don't have infinite money and time and attention and so on, and obviously helping more is better than helping less by definition. But when we combine these, what we end up with is a situation where giving effectively is actually morally virtuous. Because if we only have a finite number of resources, and if we want to do more good rather than less, then it follows that it's a good thing to try and use our resources as effectively as possible. And the reason this is important is all of us in our lives are faced by a very large number of things that we would like to change in the world. And unfortunately, philanthropy involves hard choices because none of us is able to make every single change that we would like to see in the world happen. And so that means we have to get into the game of prioritizing where we're going to give. And what effective giving does is say, knowing that, we should think about prioritizing around effectiveness rather than prioritizing on things like, do I have an emotional connection to this cause? Did they use a particularly effective piece of marketing to get my attention? And so on and so forth. So if you agree with most of these statements, you're probably an effective giver already. Now, I run One for the World, and our mission is to build a movement of people revolutionizing charitable giving to end extreme poverty. And we do that through education, training, and community building. But what's important to know is we are part of a wider movement that is trying to get people to think more about effectiveness when they give, because an extraordinarily large amount of money is given to charity each year, and yet many of the problems that we want to see solved are not getting solved over time. And so we believe that if everybody prioritised cost effectiveness, we would start to change incentives in the charitable sector, and we would start to see a lot more change in the world. Now, we're the sort of entry point into this movement because we promote a pledge where people give 1% of their income to highly cost-effective charities that work in global health and poverty. But there are lots of other organisations and parts of the movement out there who are pitching to different audiences, like particularly founders of companies or athletes or even artists, I heard about the other day, is coming down the track. And also people who pitch different levels of donation or different types of donation. So donating equity, donating a higher percentage of your income, donating some of your inheritance and so on. But we see ourselves as kind of the entry point, and that's why we do a lot of outreach like this, because we're trying to spread the net as wide as possible. We're trying to let as many people know about the principles of effective giving as possible and welcome them into the movement. Now, why do we need to educate people about charitable giving? Well, basically, because charitable giving is an extremely messed up market. So in an ordinary market, at least in theory, money goes to the places that perform the best. I mean, I'm sure you can all think of counterexamples to that, but in theory, that's how it works. The biggest companies in the world, like this one, are in that category because they provide a service that lots of people want and they do it better than their competitors. But unfortunately, within the charitable sector, that's not true at all. There's very little correlation between the size of a charity and how much effectiveness it has. And we think the reason for this is that donors don't spend that much time thinking about where to donate. So this is based on research from GuideStar and Hope Consulting, and I think this is incredibly surprising. So only 1 in 3 donors do any research at all when they're giving to non-profits. And maybe you think, well, that's not me, I'm a very sophisticated donor, but I promise you that I do this, and I literally work full-time in the effective giving movement, because of the pandemic, everyone I know who tried to get married in the last 2 years couldn't, so I went to 6 weddings this summer, and all of them said, don't buy me a wedding present, give to this charity that I've nominated, and I did. I don't even remember what they're called, let alone what they do. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So there are all scenarios where we'll hand over money to a charity without knowing anything about it. And then of the people who do some research, 2/3 of them are just trying to validate a choice that they've already made. So imagine if I convince you to donate to One for the World, you might go on our website and have a look at what we do, but you've already decided to, you're just trying to validate that choice. Now, in contrast to this, only 3% of donors do comparative research between different non-profits. And this is completely wild, because this is not how we make economic decisions in any other part of our lives. I am a terrible coffee snob, and so I won't go into a coffee shop until I've looked to see how many Google stars it has to find out where I'm going to get the best coffee. I came here on a train, so I had a look at a lot of different options for how to get here. I looked at flying, I looked at getting a train, I looked at driving, and I worked out which one was going to provide the best value and the best experience for me. When I go on holiday, I will obsessively look at different options for booking accommodation, and so on, and so on, and so on. And we're prepared to spend a lot of time comparing different options, and there are even industries that help us to make that comparison more easily. And yet when it comes to the charitable side of our economic spending, we're just prepared to do it without thinking about it at all. Now, why is that? Well, one reason I think is really positive, which is we have a very high level of trust in the charitable sector, and that's good, and we should try to keep that. That is a good thing that we trust people who work in charities for the most part, because I've worked in this sector for 12 years, so I've always worked in the charitable sector, and almost everyone that I've met in it has been really diligently working on a difficult problem without enough resources. And so it's good that we have that level of trust. But the other reason we think is that we don't think the stakes are that high. So if you ask people, what do you think the difference is between an average and a brilliant non-profit in terms of impact, most people say a number somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5 times. Now, I have been told that you only ever remember 3 things from every presentation that you watch, and if that is true, I want one of the things that you remember to be this. The best charities in the world are demonstrably 100 to 1,000 times more cost-effective than the average. And if we knew this, I think we would spend a lot more time thinking about where we give. So, I'm just going to throw this open to the audience in the room and say, can anybody tell me about the last gift that they made to charity and what motivated you to make that gift? And I'll repeat it back into the microphone so people can hear it at home. Right, so you donated to UNICEF and the Ukrainian Children Fund. What motivated you to do that?
So I watched a video made by a Ukrainian company describing how many children lost the access to water and food, and I thought that it isn't the right situation and I should try to change it.
Yeah, so for people who are watching online, the donor watched a video explaining the effect of the recent war in Ukraine on children's access to things like food and education and so on, and felt motivated to try and correct that wrong in the world. And presumably you had some sort of emotional response to that video. I'm assuming it wasn't a series of very dry graphs looking at the effect of this, telling individual stories and so on. Yeah, perfect. Anybody else prepared to share a gift that they made to charity and what motivated them to do that?
London Air Ambulance. It was a fundraiser because somebody that is a coach I have, which is coaching me to learn to play the game for free, and so instead he asked to donate to charity, to his fundraiser for this charity.
Great, so I'll just repeat that. So it's a donation, I think, to the London Air Ambulance, you said, and because you're working with a coach who's coaching you pro bono, and they asked you to make a donation in lieu of a fee. Okay, so someone you know who I guess you have some trust in, but also you felt you owed something to, asked you to do that donation, and so you did. Right, so these are great examples because in both cases, there's some sort of personal connection to the cause. And actually, I do this talk a lot, and what I often hear is stuff the way it's even more personal than that. My friend set up this non-profit, or someone in my family was affected by this health condition, and so I chose to make a gift towards research in it. And we see this over and over again, that almost all of our charitable giving is determined by some sort of personal connection. Maybe you volunteer there, maybe it works locally to you, etc. What we're promoting is a different approach to charitable giving that we think sits alongside this. And it says, okay, if we start off from the point of view of saying, I'm agnostic about where I'm going to end up giving, but I just want to find out where the numbers will take me, then we look for things like, is there evidence that the program actually works? I'm just going to throw this out to you. Do you know how many non-profits there are registered in the UK? Can anyone guess what the number is? 100 at the back. Any other guesses? 10,000. It's about 170,000 in the UK. And do you know how many are registered in the US? Anyone want to guess? So the US is what, about 5 times the population of the UK? 1 million. 1 million. Any other guesses? So it's 1.7 million. It's about 1.7 million non-profits registered in the US. Only a tiny fraction of these can show with any type of reliability that what they're doing is making the world a better place. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily doing good work. It just means that they can't demonstrate it. And so we should have a lot of uncertainty about whether when we give money to these causes, whether they actually have a positive impact down the line. And so one of the first things that we do is just screen these charities that we could give to say, well, what is the evidence that this program actually works? Because that's a massive screening question that gets rid of at least 90% of charities in the first round. And then we say, okay, if we know that the method works, if it's something where we have very high confidence in it, like giving out malarial bed nets, which organizations deliver this most efficiently? Because this is a real example. There are 2 non-profits I know that deliver bed nets, and one of them does it for about $11 per net, and one of them does it for about $5 per net. And so obviously we go to the one that does it more efficiently, presuming that they're equally, good quality bed nets, and presuming that they're equally able to, monitor their use afterwards and so on and so forth. And so when we do this, we end up focusing on cost effectiveness. And that is basically, for every dollar that we put in, how much difference does it make? Now, it's really important to say, yes, hello.
Sorry, Jack, I've just been asked to say to the audience online that they can ask questions, and we'll be able to hear them and either relay them to you, or maybe you can hear. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work.
Okay, well, that's great, because there's a whole slide called questions later that I did wonder whether we're going to get much response. So I really look forward to that. Now, the important thing to say about this, because the high probability is that you're already doing personal giving. And I just want to validate that and say, look, all giving to charity, with very, very rare exceptions, is a good thing. And it's something that we should encourage. And I do giving that is not data-driven. I give to about sort of 2.5% of my income to things that I either think are speculatively good but have very mixed evidence for them, or they're just something I have a personal connection to. I think that's a really good thing to do. But what we know from the previous slide, in fact, I think I can go back to it, maybe not. Oh. What we know from this slide is that almost everybody is failing to do even a cursory level of due diligence on their giving. And so that tells us that effective giving is neglected. There just isn't very much of it. And to give you some idea, I had a look in the States, and last year about $470 billion was given to charity, and as best I could make out, around $4 billion of that was given to highly cost-effective non-profits. And so that's 1% of the market that's going to really cost-effective places. And so we're not saying you have to abandon every bit of charitable giving that you're doing that doesn't align with our principles, but we're saying this should be part of your charitable portfolio. And if you back some of the charities that we've identified, you will know that a proportion of your income is going to making real change in the world. And that, I think, frees you up then to do other types of giving that might be more speculative, or maybe you have an advantage over the charity evaluators because you really know this non-profit well, or you can see the way it works in your local area or anything like that. Now, obviously, I said at the start I'd try to answer 3 questions, and they were why give, where to give, and how much. And I think it's easy to skip over the first question of why give at all. And we kind of hinted at an answer to this at the start, because we put up that statement that said we think it's important to help others, and notice that we all behave in this way all the time. But there's a really, I think, clean demonstration of this in a thought experiment called the Drowning Child Experiment, and it goes like this. Imagine that you're walking through a park, and in the center of the park there's a pond, and in the center of the pond, there's a small child struggling to stay above the water. And you look around and you can't see anybody else, it's just you and the child. Would you jump in and try to save the child from drowning, or would you just walk on past? Well, obviously we would jump in and try and save the child from drowning. We would realize that that's an incredible moral opportunity. I mean, that might be the best thing that we do in our lives ever. But we'd also recognize there's some obligation there, because if we just walked past and then met up with a friend for coffee and said, oh, the weirdest thing happened, I was in that park and I think there was a child drowning in the pond, but I didn't stop to find out and came and met you for coffee, they're going to ask questions about how we thought about that situation. So it's both an opportunity, but there's also a genuine obligation. If we can help someone who's in real distress at no real cost to ourselves, we should do it. Now imagine that the reason we're going through this park is actually that we're going to work, and we've got a really important pitch, and we've got our laptop in our bag and our phone in our pocket, and we're dressed up and wearing our best clothes. And if we jump in and save the child from drowning, we're going to ruin those things, and we're going to have to pay to replace them. Would we still jump in and try and save the child from drowning? Well, yes, of course. We would recognize that the value of the life of the child is exceptionally high, and also that the expenditure on replacing these items is completely trivial in comparison to that value. So we would obviously not worry about our having to replace our best shoes or having to replace our laptop and think that that was a reasonable excuse for just walking on past because we had these expensive items on us. Now imagine that instead of walking through this park and seeing this child in front of us, we just know that they exist. So we can't see them, we don't come across them in the morning, we can't jump in and try and pull them out of the pond and help them directly. But we know that there's a child out there that is going to die for no good reason in a completely preventable way, and that situation exists, it's just not right in front of us. And now imagine that instead of having the option to jump in and pull the child out, we're just told, well, if you donate the cost of your phone or your laptop or the cost of your best clothes, you will be able to save the child's life. Would we still take that deal? Now, it's interesting because whenever I do this, people are completely in agreement until we get to the third step. But this is curious because the moral situation is exactly the same. The cost is the same, which is there is a child that is going to die completely preventably, and the cost to us is exactly the same, which is we have to exchange the cost of replacing our phone, laptop, shoes, in order to save the life of the child. And yet suddenly we get really worried because it's in the abstract and we wonder what we're committing ourselves to. But the reason this is important is it's not actually just a thought experiment. We are in this situation every day, we just don't realize it. And that's because, unfortunately, it's not just one child in a pond. In this analogy, the pond represents extreme poverty. Now, extreme poverty is defined as living on less than $1.90 of resources per day. And that's adjusted for purchasing power. So I think when people hear this, the first thing they think is, oh, well, maybe $1.90 goes a lot further in some countries than it does here. But this is adjusted for purchasing power. So it's literally the equivalent of surviving on $1.90 in a US city, or I guess around, what, £1? Well, probably these days £1.90, but like £1.60, £1.70 in London. And then the second thought people have is, well, that's just stupid. There's obviously no way I could do that. How could you possibly survive on that amount of money? Well, yeah, it is stupid. It's completely preposterous to try to do this. And what it does is force you to make incredibly difficult choices. So people who live in extreme poverty, they're just like us, but they have impossible choices to make all the time. And those choices are things like, am I going to send my kids to school or am I going to feed them? Because I can't afford to do both. Am I going to get treatment for a persistent health issue, or am I going to repair the roof on my house, which is leaking and is the reason that I got sick in the first place? Am I going to buy some fertilizer, which will ultimately let me grow more food and make some money next summer, or am I going to pay to put food on the table today? And when you're faced by these impossible choices every single day, multiple times a day, eventually you just run out of road. And that's why extreme poverty kills around 14,500 children every day. And these children die because they don't have access to clean, safe water, they don't have access to enough food, or because they get a disease which is completely preventable or completely treatable, but they don't have access to the resources needed not to get sick or to get better once they're ill. Now, how do we deal with this sort of scale of this problem? Because there's a thing called scope insensitivity, which basically means the amount of sympathy we feel for one tragedy is not multiplied by 10 when we know that 10 people were affected by the same tragedy. And it's not multiplied by 100 when we know 100 people. So basically, as we scale the size of a problem, we fail to empathize as much every time we go up an order of magnitude. And so the idea of trying to actually mentally engage with 14,500 children dying every day is almost impossible. And so I'm going to give you another thought experiment, although this one is incredibly bleak. If you imagine a plane, and you imagine that every single seat on the plane had a child under 5 sitting in it. And then imagine that that plane crashes and everybody on board is killed. Well, if that happened every single hour, every day, all year, that would kill around 14,500 children a day, or around 5.5 million each year. Now, if that happened even once, it would be the dominant news story of the year. We would ground planes, we would hold parliamentary hearings to find out what had happened, and we would take any steps necessary to make sure that that absolutely terrible tragedy never happened again. And yet, we're prepared to tolerate the same moral cost every single day. It's just it happens a long way away, out of sight. It's not news because it's been happening for a long time. It's not visually compelling in the same way that the wreckage of a crash site is. And so we just don't think about it. Now, this is a really, I think, bleak part of the presentation. You might be relieved to hear this is actually the bleakest part of the presentation. It really picks up from here. But the really good news in the middle of this situation, and the more I give this talk, the more I just become astonished that we live in a world where this is true. But we do, and the answer to that is not to hide from this fact. It is to engage with it and understand it and try to wrestle with the moral consequences of it. The good news is that every single one of these deaths is actually preventable. And the only thing we need to do is to give, and give effectively to prevent them. So, I've covered why, and now we're going on to, well, where should we give? And so I have a quiz for you, and you can do this at home if you're working from home or dialing in remotely. Imagine you have $1,000 to spend on a health intervention in a low-income country, and you've got 3 options. You can provide piped water and flushing toilets infrastructure, you can provide people with chlorine to disinfect their drinking water, or you can provide children who are ill with zinc and oral rehydration salts, or we call them in the UK electrolyte salts. Which of these 3 programs would you choose to donate $1,000 to in order to get the most healthy years of life for your investment? So I'll do this in the room with a show of hands, and if you're at home, you can, I guess, you can put it in the chat if there's a chat function, or you can just play along for yourself. So who would go for program A, which is piped water and flushing toilets infrastructure? Any takers in the room? Yes, 1. Okay. Program B, chlorination to disinfect drinking water. 2. And program C, zinc and oral rehydration salts, okay, 1. Okay, so we've got a spread in the room, but the most popular answer was B. Now, this is based on a set of research called the Disease Control Priorities Project. You can look it up at dcp-3.org, and it's a big meta-analysis of health interventions in low-income countries. And on the following slides, a heart equals a counterfactual year of healthy life. So that means if we had two groups of people, roughly, roughly 10,000 each, usually in these studies, and they live in similar circumstances, they resemble each other in terms of demographics, geography, economy, political circumstances, and so on, and we give the treatment to one group and not the other, what's the difference in outcome between the two groups? And so if you went for piped water and flushing toilets, which someone did, I have two really good bits of news for you. So the first one is this program demonstrably works. So we can see in the data, you know, I said earlier there's 170,000 registered charities in the UK. Well, we know that this would be in the top percentage of them because the program definitely has a beneficial effect. And the second thing about this is it's actually really cost effective because you could get a year of healthy life through this program for about $2,000. And to give you a point of comparison, in most high-income countries, we'll spend between $75,000 and $150,000 to get a year of healthy life through a treatment, and that's considered cost-effective. So really good news is it definitely works, it's very cost-effective. The bad news, as you've probably guessed, is it is the worst program that we asked you about, so bad luck. But household chlorination, which two of you went for, it's around 10 times more effective than that. But if you went for zinc and oral rehydration salts, you're getting about 33 years of extra healthy life for that investment. Now, why is the difference so stark? Because you might be thinking, well, last time I checked, in high-income countries, we built piped water and flushing toilets. We didn't go around giving everybody zinc and oral rehydration salts and letting them get on with their life. Well, it's all to do with the cost of the program. So all of them are beneficial, but if you think about piped water and flushing toilets infrastructure, there's no point having a toilet that flushes if it just flushes into a river that's used as a drinking source. And a huge part of the disease burden in low-income countries is from people drinking water that is contaminated with human or animal waste. And likewise, there's no point having a pipe that brings water into your house if the water that's in it is not safe to drink. And then you've got to think about the challenges of trying to connect up remote villages, for example, in countries that don't have amazing infrastructure to begin with, and you start to realize how expensive it is to do these programs. And so although you do see a lot of benefit from this if you employ it, your $1,000 is only going to pay for a fraction of one program. And so you only get to claim a fraction of the benefit. Now, by contrast, you can get zinc and oral rehydration salts into someone's hands for less than $1 per person. And so if you've ever used electrolyte salts, perish the thought, if you've ever been hungover and used electrolyte salts, you will know that they rehydrate you incredibly efficiently. And yet, in a lot of places in the world, dehydration is actually a killer. And so if you get something as mundane as diarrhea, it can kill you. There are tens of thousands of people who die each year because they got diarrhea and got so dehydrated that they died. And so you're able to get this huge benefit for a very, very low cost. And that's why it's so cost effective. But of course, I set the parameters for this, and I only gave you a choice of 3 programs. But you as donors can choose to donate anywhere in the world. So what happens if we zoom out and think about any disease in a low-income country? Well, the World Bank's best guess is that $1,000 spent treating and preventing malaria produces 200 years of counterfactual healthy life. Now, we said earlier, I said I wanted you to remember one thing from the start of the presentation, and that was that the difference in effectiveness between an average and a great non-profit is 100 to 1,000x. Well, this is it. Because for your $1,000, you can get 6 months of healthy life, or you can get 200 years. And this is within the narrow group of non-profits where what they do definitely works. And so we think malaria treatment and prevention is just one of the most outstanding donation opportunities available to anyone in the world right now. Now, at this point in the presentation, I'd like to introduce you to Zawadi. So this is Zawadi on the left of the photograph, and that's her mum, and she's buying flour in their local village miller. And the orange and black machine in the middle of the photograph, that's called a dosifier, and it just adds vitamins into and nutrients into the flour. So we do this in high-income countries as well. We fortify cereals and breads and milk and stuff like that. And it means when you bake with that flour, you get more nutritional benefit than you would otherwise. Now, unfortunately, when she was younger, Zawadi was malnourished because despite the best efforts of her parents and their care and diligence, they just weren't able to get her enough calories or a wide enough range of calories for her to be well. And that meant she was in real danger of joining those thousands of children under 5 who die every day for completely preventable reasons. But the good news is that because of interventions like the dosifier and the continued diligence and care of her parents, she's no longer malnourished, and she survived her 5th birthday, and that means she has all the opportunities available to her that every little girl everywhere in the world should have. And that's things like going to school, going to university, meeting someone and falling in love, starting a family, starting a business, getting a job. All of those opportunities are available to her. Exactly like every little girl that you know who has those opportunities in front of her. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, for two reasons, really. The first one is, sometimes when people hear about the idea of getting the most impact possible from their donations, they think that it sounds really heartless. So they think it removes the humanity from philanthropy. But I think completely the opposite, because every single one of these numbers has a real person sitting behind it, like Zawadi. Every single time we talk about counterfactual years of healthy life, what we're talking about is real people, just like us, who were born into terrible circumstances, but they love and are loved by other people. They're unique, they have aspirations for the future. And so I don't think this is heartless at all. I think concentrating on trying to help as many of these people as possible is actually deeply compassionate. And the second thing that's really important is, lots of non-profits would have started with this slide, because there's a bunch of research that says it's called the identifiable victim or participant effect. If you put up an identifiable participant, you will raise more money. And I could probably do a whip round now for Zawadi, and we'd raise a bunch of money, and it would really help her. But that doesn't help the next-door neighbour of Zawadi, or the little girl down the road, or the little girl in the next village, or any of the other children who are in danger of dying before their 5th birthday. And the reason that I think effective giving is so unusual is it gives us the chance to combine when we give with our heart and with our head. Because we give with our heart when we remember that people who live in extreme poverty are real people who deserve the same chance at life that we have. But we give with our heads when we say, but we have a firm commitment to helping absolutely as many of those people as possible and giving as many people as possible a fair crack of the whip. And so I think effective giving is somewhat unique. Now, I should say at this point, for the sake of transparency, Zawadi is not actually Zawadi's real name, because we change any details around children when we share them with anybody in our presentations. But she is a real little girl, and she and her parents did give permission for her story to be shared with you today. And I am delighted to say that she is, in fact, doing really well. But I just wanted to say that, I guess, for the sake of transparency and good form. So, okay. We've reached the point where I hope I've convinced you of a few things. I really hope I've surprised you with some stuff, actually. That's the thing I hope the most, is that there's something I said that you just didn't know was true. Maybe the relative effectiveness of different charities. Maybe you got the quiz wrong and you're thinking, oh, that's really interesting, I didn't know that. But I really hope I've convinced you that some charities are significantly more cost-effective than others. And I hope I've convinced you that guessing which ones are which is a really bad idea, because we did the quiz and most people got it wrong. And by the way, for what it's worth, I got it wrong when I first saw it, and this is my actual job. So it's pretty hard. So the question is, okay, I've reached this point of puzzlement, but where should I actually give? Well, one set of answers to that comes from research from charity evaluators. And we work with one particularly called GiveWell, who do about 20,000 hours a year of research. So I think they have around 50 full-time research staff. And all they do is look into the cost effectiveness of different programs around the world and keep an eye on the latest evidence coming out about how much of an effect they have and how cheaply it can be delivered. And they recommend these 4 causes as the most cost-effective donation options anywhere right now. And these are the Against Malaria Foundation, Malaria Consortium, Seasonal Malaria Chemo Prevention, New Incentives, and Helen Keller's Vitamin A program. Now, there's a few things that these programs have in common. The first one is they're dealing with problems that are very large and lethal. So we're talking about malaria. Malaria killed about 620,000 people last year. The majority of those deaths happened in children under 5. It's also the most prevalent killer of pregnant women on the planet. Vitamin A deficiency killed around 200,000 children last year, and it caused around 400,000 children to go blind. So very widespread problem, very, very severe consequences. And if you look at the things that New Incentives is incentivizing people to get vaccinated against, it's things like measles, diphtheria, tetanus. These are things that are very widespread in some parts of the world. They're almost completely eradicated in high-income countries, but they are incredibly severe and they are widespread. And the second thing you'll notice is that it's very, very cheap to do these programs. So the Against Malaria Foundation, for around £4.50, can buy a net, spray it with insecticide, send it to someone in a malarial area, teach them how to use it, and monitor it afterwards to check whether it was used correctly and whether it helps to avert a case of malaria. Now, a malaria consortium's program, under £7 per treatment with anti-malarial drugs. Helen Keller Vitamin A, under £2 for a year's worth of these vitamin A supplements. And so we're talking about incredibly low unit cost for incredibly severe problems. And it's worth saying, you've probably seen stats like this from charities before, but they will have been round numbers. And the reason for that is that they're made up. So most of the time, when you see $5 buys a bed net, $10 buys clean water for a month, $50 buys mentoring for someone who's struggling, etc., those are what are called buy-ins in charitable marketing, and there's a reason they're always a round number, and it's because they're just a marketing trick. They're just a way of getting you to think that if you give a round number, you're going to be able to make a difference. And actually, I read somewhere in the States that the most common number is $19 because they ran a load of tests and found out that's the one where people are most prone to give, is if you put 19 up. So the challenge in charitable marketing is not do a really good job and then tell people how much it costs. It's try to find something in your charity that costs around $19. That's the marketing challenge for charities. But these numbers you can take to the bank, because these are based on extensive modelling, and in every single situation where we're uncertain or the cost varies, we take the most pessimistic outlook. And just to give you an example of this, New Incentives offers caregivers a small amount of money every time they get their child vaccinated, and a larger amount of money if they get them vaccinated against all 9 conditions. I don't think I've listed all of them on the screen. And we say that that costs about £158. In reality, half of that cost is paid by the government of the country where it runs in northwestern Nigeria. So half of that is paid for by the Nigerian government. But we want to say, in the event that the Nigerian government stopped paying for this and we thought that we needed to continue it, how much would it actually cost to do it? And so even then, we're actually being pessimistic. We could tell you that it costs about £84 to do this, £79. You see my maths letting me down on the fly. But we don't. We try to tell you what the absolute worst case scenario is. And so these are highly reliable numbers. And then the other thing you probably noticed about them is they all work in low-income countries. Now, why is that? Well, if you think about what £50 can buy you in London, I don't know, what, a meal for 2? £50 is more than a month's wages in a number of countries in the world. So if you take that £50, and even if you take out some costs for moving it to somewhere like northwest Nigeria, you are going to find that it goes a lot further there in buying goods and services. And so, broadly speaking, you're going to get about 100 times more benefit if you donate to countries that have weaker economies than ours. And this is a huge opportunity for us as donors in high-income countries, because you can just give your £50 and it costs you exactly the same, but you're going to get 100 times more benefit somewhere else. And so we think the best and most cost-effective donation opportunities are all in low-income countries. Now, that may run against some of the things that you've absorbed about charitable giving, because there's a lot of inertia around this idea that we should donate in our local area. But if you think about at the start of this, we said that all people are of equal moral value. And that means that a 4-year-old deserves the same chance of surviving whether they live in northwest Nigeria or whether they live in northwest London. And if you believe that, and then you have the chance to spend £50 in one of those 2 places, but you're going to do 100 times more good in one of them, that, I think, is a very compelling argument for doing at least some of your giving outside the place where you live. So, okay, crunch time. Hopefully I've convinced you these are good non-profits to support. Hopefully you've accepted that you should take my advice because you all got the quiz wrong. And so now we're thinking, right, okay, well, how much? How much are we going to think about giving? Well, the best way to think about this is in percentages. And this is a tool called the How Rich Am I calculator. It's extremely revealing. If you're at home, you can go to howrichami.givingwhatwecan.org. And you put in your income, and I was told that this was a salary that people at Facebook would identify with. So I don't know that, but I was told this is something that maybe it was an entry-level salary in the company, and hopefully this is around what you're paid, or maybe you're lucky and you're paid a bit more than this. And if you're paid £70,000, that puts you in the top 1% of the global population by wealth. And it means that you earn around 36 times the global median. But what you can also do with this tool is see what happens if you donate 1% of your income, which is the One for the World pledge. Well, at that point, you only earn £69,300. But the great news is you're still in the top 1% of the global population by wealth, and you're still earning 35.7 times the global median. And at the same time, you can fund 195 bed nets and 1,000 treatments for schistosomiasis, which is a parasitic worm disease. And roughly every 3 years, one of the treatments you funded will be used by someone who otherwise would have got sick and also died. So roughly every 3 years, you're going to prevent a death. Now, the reason I put this up is I hope that we can agree that someone who earns £70,000 a year doesn't have a materially better life than someone who earns 69,300. So can they achieve everything they want? Can they buy a house in Chelsea and have a private jet and have a gold-plated jet ski that they use on the weekends? No, they probably can't. But they couldn't do that on £70,000 either. The point is their material quality of life is the same. And yet the ethical richness of their life, and if you're into that, the spiritual richness of their life, knowing that roughly every 3 years they're going to avert a death, is enormous. And so this is why we call the 1% pledge barely noticeable, because it is barely noticeable. You'll literally live the same life you were living before. It's just that you'll be doing a lot of good at the same time. So this is what we think of as the entry point into effective giving. And if you're thinking of giving it a try for the first time, think in percentages and think about giving 1% of your income. But there is also another pledge that we promote. And this is the pledge that I took when I was 21, because I read a book about this stuff, and I was pretty radicalized by it, which is why I'm still talking about it 12 years later. And that's to give 10% of your income away. And if you do that, you're going to have an income of £63,000. Great news, you're still in the top 1% of the global population by wealth. And at this point, you're earning about 32 times what the median person in the world earns. But at the same time, you're funding nearly 2,000 bed nets and over 10,000 treatments for schistosomiasis, and roughly every year, roughly 3 deaths will be averted because of your giving. Now, at this point, I can't say that this is barely noticeable. I think there's a possibility that you might have to, go on a less flashy holiday. In my case, take fewer Ubers when public transport is running, which I think is my sort of guilty pleasure spending. Maybe you might not get takeaway food as often. Maybe you might have to wait another 6 months to pay off your mortgage. But I still think at this point that you can have a perfectly excellent life where you get to do a lot of things that you enjoy and you can still meet most of your financial goals. And that small sacrifice is turning into nearly 3 deaths averted every year. And so I like to think about this as, okay, if 1% is barely noticeable, 10% is really meaningful. Because at that point, you might have to think about not doing something in your life that you were going to do before. But what you've got to think about is, which is more important ultimately? Is it for me to be that extra bit closer to my financial goals, or is it to help someone who might otherwise be burying their child tomorrow? Because unfortunately, and this is not the fault of anyone in this room, that is the choice that is in front of us all the time. Now, this gets tricky because if you follow that argument to its logical conclusion, you end up at the point where you should give away literally everything you own. And this has been identified as a problem with the drowning child analogy, which is it's very hard to think of something that would make you walk past the pond and not try and save the child. But what I would say is most people look at this and think, well, it gets kind of tricky at the pointy end. Yeah, it does get tricky at the pointy end. And the minute any of us start giving, 50% of our salary away, we'll start talking about what the upper bound of acceptable is. But the truth for most of us is the average person in a high-income country is giving between 2 and 6% of their income away. So we can be doing the 1% pledge and be below average, and we can be doing the 10% pledge and only being marginally above average. So this is an achievable amount of giving, and if you're already giving, or if you're really inspired by this, I would encourage you to think about a 10% pledge. Now, another thing that comes up a lot is regular giving. Why do we do regular giving instead of one-off? Well, basically, it's more effective. So this does depend slightly on the size of the gift. If you're giving more than, I would say, probably about £20,000 a year, then there might be reasons to go to one-off giving. But for most people, you want this to be predictable for you so that you're budgeting it so it's not a shock when it comes out of your bank account. And you want the charities that you're giving to be able to predict around this and to scale in a predictable way. And that means that giving regularly makes you a much more effective philanthropist. And why would you do this through us? Well, 3 reasons. First of all, every 3 months, we will send you a report that says exactly what your money did. And I don't know about you, but every charity I donate to that's not effective, I really don't know what's done with that money. I might hear from them once a year. But with us, every 3 months, you will find out where that money went and what was done with it. Secondly, we stay on top of the research. This is roughly as difficult as picking amazing stocks to invest in on the stock market. I think that's a good analogy. It takes a lot of technical expertise and it takes a lot of time. And so you probably don't have the time or the expertise to be doing this yourself day to day. But we will do this for you. So we have removed a number of charities from our portfolio because the evidence suggested they weren't as cost effective. And we're pretty confident we're going to add a number to our portfolio in the next 12 months and beyond. And so we're just doing that all the time. And then critically, and this is really important, we don't take any money out of your donations for our own costs. So once it hits our bank account, depending on how you donate, it may have credit card fees taken out of it by Stripe, or it may have that we use a piece of donational software that takes, I think, 2%. But other forms of giving can be even more efficient than that. Once it lands in our bank account, every single cent of that, every single penny is moved on. And that's because we're lucky that our costs are paid for by grants and high net worth individuals. But this is important because I think people sometimes think we're getting up here and trying to come between them and the charities and trying to take a cut and that we're working on commission. Well, we're just not. We're just trying to get more people to do this. And if enough of us do it, the impact is staggering. So this is what One for the World members have achieved over the last few years. Nearly $3.5 million donated, hundreds of thousands of treatments, hundreds of thousands of dollars given to people in extreme poverty. But the bit that's really important here is in the bottom right, which is at least 500 people have a chance at life because of the actions of people who were giving a small amount each month. And that's just staggering. I mean, I've accepted at this point that I'm not going to run into a burning building and pull someone out, and I'm not going to dive into the sea and save someone from drowning, and yet I am part of a movement where by giving a small, affordable amount each month, 500 people get a fair crack at life. And part of the deal with effective giving is we don't get to meet them, we don't get to see who we helped. It's not about a personal connection by us, as the donor to the people who've benefited. But just imagine if you could meet even one person who had an actual chance at life because of something that you had done in your own life. I just think that would be the most amazing thing. And I'm really, really proud of this number. And the great thing is it's going up. I've actually noticed this slide is out of date because it's over 530 now and it's 3.6 million because giving season was good to us. So all the time we're just helping more and more people and giving them a chance to have some agency in their own life. And so my ask is very simple. Please pledge at least 1% of your income through One for the World to the most cost-effective non-profits in the world. And if you're interested in doing that, Meta is running an entire giving month. There's a QR code in the bottom right. There are links that you can go to, and all of these will take you to the point where you can donate. And amazingly, Meta has also put up $30,000 in match funding. So if you make a donation this month, it will be doubled, as long as you're in the first 30,000 that's donated. And so I really, really encourage you to take action. The biggest reason people don't take action after this talk is that they just don't do it straight away, and so they go away and then they forget about it. But if you want to join the movement, you can take the first step in that today. So I really hope that's been surprising and interesting. Links are on the screen, QR codes on the screen, and I'd love to hear any questions in the room or any questions from people at home.
How do the guys on the Zoom call ask the question?
No questions here.
Okay, we've got one in the room though, so that's good.
So, you have a view on pros and cons of gift aid?
Yes, they're all positive though. So gift aid is, I think, unique. I've done charitable fundraising. I live in Europe. I do most of my fundraising in America. I've also fundraised in Australia. I've never seen this system anywhere else. The UK government will donate the basic rate of tax that you've already paid on your income to the charity if you register for gift aid. So if you check out through these links and you're a UK donor, it will give you the chance to do that. What that means in effect is it increases the value of the donation by 25%. I think it's amazing that we do that. It's a massive multiplier on charitable giving, and it's free to you and everybody else. So I really encourage you to do it. Any other questions in the room or at home?
How do you source your charities?
Yes, the question for those at home is how do you source your charities? So we're in full alignment with GiveWell at the moment. So at the moment, we're only using them. But there are other charity evaluators out there. GiveWell is the biggest organisation and does the most work per year on this issue. But because they take this agnostic view around where they're going to donate, they've ended up in global health and poverty, which is probably the most cost-effective area to donate in. Actually, if there's any effective altruists on the call, they're going to be furious with me for saying that. But anyway, we could have a whole argument about it. Maybe the comments section will light up now with people talking about other areas. But basically, there's a number of really good charity evaluators who use this type of framework. Animal charity evaluators do stuff in animal welfare. Founders Pledge do stuff in climate change. And there's even stuff around pandemic prevention and kind of risks that might wipe out the whole of humanity, nuclear war by mistake and stuff. We use GiveWell. We think they're the most rigorous, and also we think that as an entry point to effective giving, global health and poverty has a lot of advantages because it's pretty easy, I think, to empathise with the plight of someone who lives in a low-income country. It's a bit harder to empathise with an animal for some people, and it's a bit harder still to empathise with a ton of carbon that we can remove from the atmosphere. But we use GiveWell's research. Yeah, we got a question online, yeah.
Hi.
Yana? Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really very informative. And I think your arguments on effective giving are really quite helpful. I did want to ask about the scenarios where, as you said, there might not be enough data. So if you do want to give, for instance, in a certain place, location, let's say, or country, maybe home country, and you don't have enough data, are there tips about certain policies? I mean, I usually think that maybe cash transfers might be a bit more effective in those cases. As opposed to maybe some education, maybe intervention or a health intervention. So it'd be really good to know if there are some safe tips maybe in those instances when you don't have good data and evidence.
Yeah, so this is called the measurability bias, which is we tend towards charities that are easier to measure. And lots of charities are really hard to measure. So a randomized control trial, which is the standard of evidence we look for, costs about $100,000, and you need about 10,000 people to do it well. So lots of charities just can't possibly do that. They're not operating at that scale. I'll give you two ways of thinking about this. One is to look for a program that we know is effective somewhere else. So you talked about cash transfers. Cash transfers are really pretty cost effective. This is just giving people money instead of doing a service, so they can do whatever they want with it. Has a range of benefits around health and education and economic security and so on. That's a good bet. Likewise, if you found something giving out anti-malarial bed nets, even if it's not the Against Malaria Foundation, pretty good program. The other thing you can do is try to evaluate the charity on its merits, and there's three things you want to look for. Number one, is there any evidence that the method works? So it might be they don't have a randomized control trial, but they might have academic backing for it. I used to run a non-profit that works in the UK called the School of Hard Knocks that uses rugby and boxing to help children who are at risk of being excluded from school not to be. We didn't have randomized control trials, but there is a very large body of academic literature about the psychological effect of playing sport and how beneficial it is, and a lot of anecdotal evidence. So one thing is evidence of effectiveness. The second thing is cost effectiveness. So if you have two things doing the same thing, can you look at their financials, which will be publicly available in most countries, and see which one's doing it most efficiently, who's reaching the most people, as long as they're both doing it to a reasonable standard. And then the third thing is room for more funding. So you can usually ask them about this, but what would they do with an extra $10,000? Because after a while, places just can't absorb any more funding and still do what they're doing at scale. But you're looking for places where your money will actually make a difference. So it's really hard. And the truth is, I'd be very surprised if you can find charities this cost effective on your own. But if you want to do that, look for evidence of effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and room for more funding.
Thanks so much.
Yes, I think there's another question online.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. This has been so interesting, very thought-provoking. Slightly off topic maybe, but your analogy about the child in the pond has really got me thinking. What are your thoughts or opinions on when you can see, and I apologize for the phrasing because I'm sure there's probably a better, more polite way of doing this, people begging on the street, because you can physically see somebody in front of you, and like with the child drowning, you would physically go and help them, but you can't see them. How does that differ in that scenario?
Yeah, this is a great question because it's completely inevitable that we have a really strong human reaction to that, and obviously I'm not immune to that. I don't think anyone is. I think it's really, your heart just bleeds when you see people who are in such obvious distress. And I've been thinking about this particularly because I live in Berlin and it's exceptionally cold at the moment, and I just cannot imagine what it must be like sleeping outside. I mean, just awful. The first thing I would say is, if you're able to, I have really changed my mind about this, and I try to give them money. because cash transfers actually have a really good track record, and I don't think we should treat people who are struggling in this country differently to people who are struggling in other countries, and cash transfer is a really good development aid. There are also agencies that do pretty good work with homelessness. St Mungo's in the UK is very good, The Big Issue is very good. There's one that I used to work with, Shelter's pretty good. So I think if that's a specific problem you see, that's the kind of thing where I would say use some of your discretionary giving. So I said earlier, I've taken a 10% pledge and I give 10% of my income to highly cost-effective charities, and then I give about 2% to other stuff, and that might be one of those examples. The problem, of course, is if you're really putting me on the spot philosophically, I don't think that your £20 is actually going to help that person as much as buying 5 bed nets would, as much as it would help the recipients of those. And that's just like a tough thing we have to wrestle with. You might remember I said at the start, there are simply too many things that we want to change in the world to be able to change all of them. And so it really comes down to, I don't feel bad about giving to things that I see straight in front of me, because I feel like I've reliably committed a decent chunk of my income to places where I know it's cost effective. And so I kind of give myself a pass on giving to the thing that particularly tugs at my heartstrings. But if that's the only philanthropy you're doing, then I think it does raise questions about, ultimately, is that person in more need than 5 children might be who are going to get malaria just because they happen to be in front of you? Does that seem like a reasonable response?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree that it's a discretionary thing, and that it's probably not wise to make it everything that you donate, but certainly something to factor into everything. Thank you. It's interesting to hear your opinion.
Yeah, no worries. Great question. Okay, I mean, I'd like to just point out, I've really timed that very well, and I've only just spotted the clock, but it's 17:59. I think this wraps up in a minute. My biggest closing thing I want to say to you is, please, please, please consider taking action on this. Many other people have. So we've done about 60 of these talks. They've raised about $600,000 in one-off gifts, and about $200,000 now every year coming in from people who've taken the pledge. We convert everything to dollars, which is why I keep using those amounts. But we need more people to join this movement. Someone asked me beforehand, how many givers would it take at 1% until we could actually eliminate all of the deaths from extreme poverty every year? I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer because you get diminishing returns on these things. But I reckon if you could get a movement of 10 to 20,000 people doing this, which is about sort of 5x the scale we're at the moment, you'd make a dent in it. And if you got anywhere near 1 million people doing this, all to highly cost-effective charities, I think you'd have an excellent chance of really eliminating these preventative deaths. But it has to start with you. If you have the means, if you have disposable income in a high-income country, and you probably have the ability to give, or maybe to give more than you are at the moment. And so I really would love it if you would take action. And I think it's amazing that match funding has been put up, and this is a time-limited opportunity to take advantage of that. So I've loved talking to you. My details are on the screen. You can set up a one-to-one chat with me if you'd like to discuss further, or in particular, if you're going to give more than £10,000, we should probably talk about the most efficient way to do that. But otherwise, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for dialing in, and thanks for coming in person.